Hey everyone, wanted to talk a little bit about tax reform and tax changes. Now that we're looking at having a change in the presidency, the big question, in my world at least, is what is this going to look like for taxes and tax reform? Well, I like to look back a little bit at history. So if we go back to the past 20 years of tax reforms, we find that there were four major tax reform acts that came out. And those were in 2001, 2003, 2010, and 2017. So in 2001 and 2003, those are referred to as the Bush tax cuts. So we had President Bush back then. And if you look at Congress and if you look at the House and the Senate in Congress, those were both controlled by Republicans. So you had a Republican president, Republican House, Republican Senate, and they were able to get through tax reform, the Bush tax cuts. Then when we get into 2010, we had President Obama at that time. Now, what happened in 2010 is there wasn't necessarily a tax law per se that was passed that year. The Bush tax cuts expired that year, so they went away, and there was no act of Congress or anything to try to renew those. But we also had the Affordable Care Act was passed that year. Now, of course, that was a health care law, but it had a lot of tax implications, many of which we're still seeing today on tax returns. There was a penalty for not having health care. There was these credits that came from getting health care on the exchange. A number of things hit the tax return from that. And if you remember, the constitutionality, messed that word up, was challenged. Because they wanted to call it unconstitutional, right? Basically, and the Supreme Court came and said, "Oh, it is constitutional because they called that penalty a tax." So in my mind, that was really a tax law, even though it was a healthcare law. And so there in 2010, we see that we had Obama as a Democrat president, and we had a Democrat-controlled House and a Democrat-controlled Senate. And then we get into 2017, and that's the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and that was done under President Trump. And we had a Republican-controlled House and a Republican-controlled Senate. So for the past 20 years, every major tax law that has passed has come because of the president, the House, and the Senate all being in the same party. There hasn't been any divided parties. So that's why a lot of people say that now that we have President-elect Biden, that there may not be a huge change in tax law coming up. Now, he's obviously a Democrat. We have the House that will be controlled by the Democrats. The Senate is kind of unknown and will not be known until it seems like the beginning of the year. There's some runoffs that are going to happen in January. So we'll see what happens there. So if the Senate does get controlled by Democrats, then we likely will see some tax law reform happen next year. But a lot of people are kind of saying that they don't expect that to happen. They expect there to be this divided Congress where the Republicans will retain control of the Senate and the Democrats will have control of the House. And if that happens, then that's what we call the gridlock, where nothing really happens, nothing really gets done. This year we had a really big, it was kind of a tax reform in some way, not huge, but the economic reform with the coronavirus and stimulus that was passed. And so we had the Republicans and the Democrats get together earlier in the year, and they passed that law. And then they all knew that another one needed to be passed, and the House went and passed one that they liked, that had, I want to say it was like a $3 trillion stimulus bill or something like that. But over on the Senate side, they didn't really like that as much, and so they didn't even give it the light of day or take it up or do much with it. So we never saw anything come about with that second stimulus bill that could have happened. So that's kind of a precursor to what may happen going forward, where you might have the House passing bills that they want to see passed, or passing bills that they want to see come into law, and then the Senate just not taking them up or not doing much with them. And it never really reaching the president's desk to sign. So that could be a likely scenario of what happens, but we'll see what happens going forward. If you look back a little further in history, we had President Clinton, and he in 1997, he had a really big tax law that passed, And he was able to pass that with a Republican-controlled House and Senate. He was able to reach over the aisle and get everybody on board and pass a really major tax law. President Reagan did the same thing in the 80s, was able to pass a tax law with a divided House and Senate back then. So it's not uncommon, not unlikely, but in this day and age, we haven't seen that happen in over 20 years. 1997 was the last time, so that's what, 23 years ago. By the time we get to next year, it'll be 24 years since we've had something like that happen. So anyway, something to keep an eye on, and yeah, we'll see how things play out going forward.